Damn, the man is crazy! Puka.
Welcome to my rear tire test of the REKON RACE 29-inch by 2.35-inch tire. A year ago, I got a 2019 Giant Trans Advanced Pro 29.2 with 115 millimeters of travel in the rear and 130 millimeters up front. Have had a great time on this bike, a great climbing bike and a great descending bike. The bike originally came with Maxxis Minion DHF in the front and DHR in the rear, 2.3 tires, and I have been pretty happy with those tires in most conditions. Even though I like the Minion tires, I started riding more on a cross-country style and training more for fitness, and I decided I would want to lighten up the bike a little bit and decrease the rolling resistance of the Minions to a faster rolling tire, which would make it more efficient on the climbs. And I chose the REKON for the front and the REKON RACE for the rear. If this tire test has provided you any information of value, please click the link below to see the front tire review of the Maxxis REKON 29-inch by 2.4-inch tire. Please subscribe and like this video if it was of any value to you. My Giant Trans Advanced Pro 29 came with the Giant TRX-1 wheel set. This is a carbon fiber wheel set with 30 millimeter inner rim width, 35 millimeter outer rim width. Getting the Minion DHRs off the rim was actually relatively easy, using just simple couple tire levers and a little work, and it came off pretty easy. I weighed the tire before taking it off, and the complete wheel with an XTR cassette on it weighed 2.5 kilograms, but the tire had no sealant in it. The sealant that was originally put in had obviously evaporated or was used. There was no liquid sealant, it was just the dried residue on the inside of the tire. Once I switched over to the REKON RACE, which was relatively easy and painless, getting it onto the rim, it went on quite easily. Basically I filled it up with 3 ounces of Stan's sealant and inflated it, and when I weighed that wheel it was 2.3 kilograms. Total wheel weight lost 200 grams, and if I had put in the sealant, or if there had been sealant in the DHR, we were probably looking at a difference in weight of about 300 grams between the two tires once they were on the wheel. Once I got the REKON RACE on the rim and inflated it, I inflated it to 30 psi and did some measurements and found out that the 2.35 width tire was actually 2.4, a little bit bigger than what you would think. I wanted to go with a slightly larger tire in the rear to absorb some of the shock, even though I was getting better rolling resistance out of it and lighter weight. I thought a slightly larger casing than the 2.3 that came on it with the DHR would be better. So this tire test is going to be a little bit kind of a narrow tire test in the sense that I'm not testing this tire on a wide variety of terrain. This tire test is really a review of how this tire performs on my local Southern California trails, which are mostly dry, hard pack with some sand and light gravel over it. And although the trails can be steep, it's not like riding down the side of mountains in the Pacific Northwest forests. So the characteristics of the tire are going to be specific for the type of terrain I use, and I'm going to be showing a lot about how the tire is working on the terrain, and my opinion and feelings about how the tire is working on the terrain is really going to be specific for this type of terrain. I'm not jumping big air, and it's really a cross-country application, and my review is going to be from the perspective of this tire being fast, efficient in a cross-country, dry Southern California trail environment.
Let's ride!
So the beginning of the trail that I normally ride starts out kind of rolly up and down. The first climb is a kind of a steep little pitch through an oak grove. The ground here is kind of slippery with leaves and sand. It's very steep. This is a seated climb in one of the lower gears. The DH Minion actually kind of would slip here, but the Recon Race really doesn't slip at all in this section. And in most of the climbing sections like this, I was really surprised at how sticky and how well the Recon Race is. On some of this harder pack with these steeper pitches, the sand over the hard pack, sometimes the Minion would break free a little bit, but it always caught back, it always got its grip back pretty quick. But the Recon Race is really steady and very grippy in this type of condition, this type of climb. This next section is a little bit of a little downhill with a transition into sand and then a steep pitch. In this sandy section, the Recon Race is really stable over sand, whereas the Minion would get a little squirrely with the sand. But the Recon Race really did much better in the sand. It was much more predictable and smoother in the sand. And again, these kind of steep climbs on hardpack, the Recon Race just was really sticky with lots of traction. Even when it was at 30 psi, which is relatively hard, the rolling resistance advantage, there was no loss of traction. This section is a longer downhill. Normally on the Minions I'd get up to about 27 miles an hour. With the Recon Race in the back, I was hitting 30 quite regularly. There's a little bit of jumps, some transitions, ruts, and the Recon Race really at high speed is a very stable and consistent tire. Even with little jumps and there's some rain ruts and water bars, the tire did extremely well on this section at high speed, and in the transition turns, very smooth and stable. At the end of this section, after some of these water bars and turns, it empties out into a sandy area, and again, that transition with the Recon Race is very good. This is where the Recon Race was a little bit better than the DHRs. The DHRs would get a little bit of slip in this section as well, whereas the Recon Race never had any slip. This section is very much sandstone with a light dusting of sand. The final section is actually quite gravelly and rocky. Here I get some slip with the DHRs. I'm not taking the easiest line. Halfway up this hill I switch over into the rough stuff just to see how the tire transitions into the rougher gravel and rocks. And in all honesty, the Minion did really well in the rocks here. It didn't break free very easily, but the Recon Race also did extremely well. As you can see, I'm going over larger rocks and into the gravel and whatever it takes. This is a pretty steep pitch too, and the tire really never broke free during climbing. The Recon Race does extremely well in sand. It's somewhat stable, it doesn't get pushed around easy. It actually performed for me better in sand than the DHR did for a rear tire, which felt a little more squirrely, and it wasn't, it logged down into the sand. It was harder to pedal through it. The Recon Race was much better in sand. For this section, it's a steep pitch, but what's interesting is you have to go to one side, and it's off camber climbing. And even on the off-camber climbing, the Rekon Race never really lost traction at all, even over the rougher stuff that was off-camber. It was quite surprising, especially in a section like this, that the Rekon Race did so well on the climbing. The DHRs would slip a little bit as you got closer to the angle. It actually was lose traction and kind of slip down a little bit on the rougher stuff, whereas the Rekon Race in this terrain and this type of off-camber climbing did a little bit better than the DHR, and definitely the rolling resistance was a lot less. This next section after the picnic area starts off with a fairly steep climb. There's a lot of braking ruts because people coming down this trail are locking up their wheel and cutting in little grooves into the trail. But again, the Rekon Race does really well here. And like the DHR may slip a little bit more on this climb, but once you break the Rekon Race free, it takes longer for it to hook up than the DHR, but it's much harder to break it free. And that seems to be the condition with this kind of climb and trail. Again, this is a seated spinning climb, but still you're having to torque the pedals pretty hard, and the wheel remains grippy. Take a lot to break this free, but once it does break free, it's harder to hook up. This next section is fairly steep. It has this steep little climb, then a very sharp right turn, switch back, some off-camber climbing, pretty cut up again from braking ruts and other things. Here the Rekon Race though does extremely well. The DHR Minion is just as nice a tire. I think here though you have a slight advantage on the rolling resistance, and in the braking ruts and stuff the Rekon Race does extremely well. It's very hard for it to lose traction in this steeper section. But both the Minion and the Rekon Race all were challenged by this section, which is fairly steep and rutted. Here you can see some of the ruts and grooves in the trail that become quite rough on the downhill. But going up, it can be a stopper. But the rolling resistance and the fact that you can run these tires at a higher pressure and still have the same traction as a DHR with a lower pressure really has a distinct advantage on the climbs and makes the climbs much better and much easier in these situations and types of trails. This last bit of climbing is, again, steep pitches on this kind of hard pack with loose over it, or loose kind of dry clay dirt. Again, the tires do really well here, especially even when it gets rougher. The DHR would get a little bit of slip here, whereas the Rekon Race never really slips and is extremely sticky in this type of section, even over the rockier areas and when things start getting a little bumpy.
Downhill time!
Alright, now it's time to talk about the downhill characteristics of the Rekon Race. This trail here, the start of it, is quite fast, with a few little jumps and other things in it. The traction of the Rekon Race at speed is actually quite good and does very well on these type of high-speed descents and turns. I was actually surprised how well it did as far as cornering and handling. The other thing that this tire really shows, even on steeper, technical, rough kind of descents, such as this one, the braking performance of it was actually quite good. It might break out a little bit more and quicker, but it seemed to regain its traction quite well, even through some of these steeper turns. On these downhills, when you did get a little bit of jump or air, it quickly recovered itself. It was very stable. You can see even when it's quite rough, the tire does extremely good braking. Here I'm going into the turn, hanging out the leg to get a little balance. The tire's braking characteristics, it brakes free a little bit easier than the DHR, but it hooks up easier, faster. So the skids are not as long as a DHR, but it's easier to get it to break free. But once it breaks free, it seems to dig in quicker than the DHR minions. This single track trail here has a lot of off camber and some rough off camber, and it was one of the reasons why I was looking for something like the Rekon Race, because the DHR would always break free a little bit on this off camber stuff. It would lose traction a little bit and slide out on some of these off camber turns at speed, whereas the Rekon Race actually felt a lot better on the off camber turns than the DHR did. This is a section of the trail that I always felt on the DHR minions a little more nervous because of that off-camber turning. The Rekon Race feels a little bit more secure and stickier on these kind of off-camber turns and single-track trail. Definitely felt there was an advantage with the Rekon Race on this terrain over the DHR minion. After the picnic area, the trail gets a wider truck road, and with the DHR's minions on the bike, I would consistently hit about 28 miles an hour as a top speed. But with the Rekon and the Rekon Race, I'm consistently hitting 30 on the same trail. So there's clearly it's a faster tire. But also at these speeds, 30 miles an hour, the tire is still extremely stable and confident. You don't feel like it's rocking around losing traction all the time. And I feel that it's definitely a faster rolling tire. And again, its grip on things like off camber and sand are really good. So you get the speed as well as the traction. And I found it to be a great tire for these high speed sections, especially when they have a lot of sand transitions. The Rekon Race is much more stable than the DHR minion in the sand, and made those transitions much better. The last section of this trail has a little bit of a jump, and then you have to slam on the brakes because the trail ends. With the DHR minions, I would actually slide into the weeds, whereas with the Rekon Race, it'll actually stop me before I get to it. I found the stopping performance in that kind of situation with the jump and the brake actually a little bit better than the DHR. The next sections is rocky downhill, and again, the DHR would do phenomenally well. It loves these rocks. It felt very confident and great traction. The Rekon Race felt pretty good too. Felt a little bit faster, but it handled the rocks quite well, and obviously it handles the sand transition a little bit better. Even here, when you get a little bit of off-camber turn, it does extremely well.
Here comes the dead rat.
At the top of this section, it kind of transitions back into the rollier section of trail, which is quite fast, and the Rekon Race is very comfortable in this type of terrain and this type of trail condition. One of the more challenging sections here is this slight descent. Then it turns into high speed with a turn in the sand. And again, for the DHR minions, the sand was always a little bit squirrely and not as secure, whereas the Recon race on this sand during the turn was actually much stabler and handled the sand much better and felt more comfortable, as well as a little bit faster. Near the end, there's a particularly hard right-hand turn involving a long braking line, then sliding the bike around the turn. The Recon race did extremely well in those conditions. The trail finishes up with this kind of off-camber little oak grove descent that was from the beginning of the video, and ending in the end of the trail. In summary, I would say that the Maxxis REKON RACE is a great rear tire for cross-country style riding on very dry Southern California trails. It provided excellent stability and rolling efficiency and traction. And I'm very happy to be training on these tires and would recommend them for anyone on these type of trails who is looking for a great cross-country tire.